On America's Hope, we focus on why it's important to vote and why one person is helping Generation Z understand the power and respect for voting. And we'll talk to Chonda Pierce, the country comedian who shares her story of real life and the humor she uses to live life to her best ability. America's Hope starts now.
This is America's Hope from our global headquarters in New York City. Here's Kelly Wright.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to America's Hope. So glad you could join us. And we do hope that wherever you are, that you're safe and well, taking care of yourself and your family because you matter. Right now, because it's election season and people are actually watching what's happening in terms of the presidential candidates and how closely this race could be, it's razor thin as we know. Many people are saying voting matters, get out the vote. But there are segments of society right now that are undecided. And there's one segment of society that doesn't really care about voting. We're talking about young people, Generation Z. So tonight we'll hear from Jessica Fortune Barker, who's explaining historically why voting matters and why it's a right that should be respected and protected. And then later on, we've got Chonda Pierce coming by. My, oh my, the country comic does not quit. She is an amazing talent, skilled in life, skilled in comedy, skilled in making you feel better about who you are and what you go through. In fact, she has an incredible book called Life is Funny Until It Isn't. Let's get started. Welcome once again to America's Hope. I'm joined now by Jessica Fortune Barker, and she is a keen business strategist and community organizer on a mission to educate, engage, and empower communities by producing community networks and initiatives that increase people's ability to thrive. Jessica leads a multifaceted business enterprise that is uniquely positioned to create cross-country collaborations, create cross-industry collaborations, that serve to empower positive societal impact worldwide. And Jessica, thank you for being on America's Hope. The last time we talked was during the last presidential election. We were looking at the state of Georgia in terms of how two senators were actually running. They were Democrat senators, Senator Ossoff and Senator Warnock, and they went on to win. And at that time, Georgia had flipped and turned blue. As we look at politics this year, the presidential election, what are you doing in terms of community organizing for voters to make sure that every voter gets out there and that they don't stay at home, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on?
Absolutely. And I thrive on serving in a nonpartisan capacity because we serve a mission to ensure that all eligible voters are able to cast their vote. And specifically, just as I did working in the state of Georgia back in 2021 for those senatorial runoffs, right now I still focus on the youth voice and the youth vote and making sure that our young people across the country understand the importance of the right to vote, but even more so that they understand the importance of actually showing up to exercise that right to vote. So we're blessed to engage with campuses all across the nation right now.
You know, Jessica, that is so important because as I'm looking at your background there, I see Protect Our Vote. And a lot of young people, Generation Z, this will be the first time they ever vote in a presidential election. And some of them are notably undecided, and so a few are saying they will sit on the sidelines. Do they understand the precious gift of voting and why it's important to not only protect our right to vote, but to respect our right to vote and do so?
Ooh, and you said something very critical there. It's about respecting the right to vote. And overwhelmingly, what we are finding as we engage young people is, you're correct, they're saying that they really don't want to vote because they feel neither candidate truly speaks to what they're wanting and needing in their own communities. But then that's where we have the opportunity to not only share with them the fight that our ancestors went through in making sure that we even had access to the ballot box, but we also share with them how relevant their voice truly is in today's society and how a vote today actually will impact them for generations to come.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. Now, I know you deal with voters from a nonpartisan standpoint, but you're from Alabama, you're in Huntsville, Alabama, a great state, but it's also representative of the South. And many, many years, you talked about how you're talking to young Generation Z voters about respecting the right to vote and realizing that people died for that right to vote. In the South, as you know, historically, African Americans were denied that right to vote. So is that something else you do in terms of educating Americans in the South, in the North, the East, and the West about how precious voting is?
Absolutely. I always say Alabama is the mecca of the civil rights movement. And so we know that a lot happened here in Alabama back in 1965 when they crossed the bridge in Selma, Alabama, over to Montgomery, really trying to uplift the need for the federal government to actually pay attention to those who are overwhelmingly being locked out of the electoral process. And in that movement back in the 60s, because of the work that was done in the southern states like Alabama and Georgia, we were able to see the passage and the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 by President Lyndon B. Johnson. And so what we're finding is as we are talking to our Gen Z, our millennial even voters, they are so many decades removed from that actual movement in the 60s that it's kind of hard for them to correlate what that fight really looked like. And so we use arts. We really center around using different forms of arts to bring that story of the civil rights movement and make it relevant for our young people today to be able to touch that history, to understand that history. And by engaging on that level, we are able to realize that they then start paying more attention to the necessity of why it's so important to vote today.
And using the way that the methods that you use to teach them and reminding them about Selma, which was an historic march, and as you know, it resulted in some people actually dying and being beaten and bloodied and battered by police officers back then, the state patrol. And when they made that successful march, Martin Luther King Jr. led the way. A lot of people look on Martin Luther King Jr., they think about his famous I Have a Dream speech, but they don't realize how much heavy lifting he and the people who joined him, black, white, Jewish, Christian, everybody working together to stand together and make that cross, that dangerous trek across the bridge to make their way to the state capitol, Montgomery, to demand the right to vote. Take me back then and what it means to people today and why it should be taught.
Absolutely. And I love sharing the story of that history, again, in bringing that to relevant times. But what people don't realize is that that story actually started in Marion, Alabama, which also is home to Mrs. Coretta Scott King, the wife of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And in Marion, Alabama, they were galvanizing and marching for voting rights in that city. But there was a young man that actually was killed by state troopers in Marion, Alabama. And so that movement, they wanted to carry his body from Marion to the Capitol steps in Montgomery, Alabama. However, that is when they were met with pushback from the state troopers in Selma, Alabama. People don't realize that that march actually was attempted 3 times before they were actually successful to getting to Montgomery, Alabama. And so we oftentimes share that that is the backdrop, the backstory to why they even were trying to march to Montgomery, Alabama. And so even though they were unable to actually carry that body all the way to Montgomery, once they invited Dr. Martin Luther King in and he helped coordinate from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama, that is when the federal troops were dispatched in to make sure that those voters were actually protected. And that's what brought that federal and national attention to what was going on in the state of Alabama. And that is why Lyndon B. Johnson then in August of 1965 was able to pass through the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, if you take that story and you fast forward to 2013, there was a decision, the Shelby Holder decision, that also stemmed from a case here in the state of Alabama, in Shelby County, Alabama. And that decision actually stripped and gutted the preclearances of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And once that happened in June of 2013, we automatically saw states, especially those here in the South, start to enforce laws and rules that were very strict to people actually being able to access the ballot box. For instance, strict voter ID laws and other things that were not previously in place because of the protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So if you look more at our current history, and when we share this with young people and share with them that just in 2013, people were fighting against us being able to access the ballot box, that kind of brings it home for them again of the necessity that if they're trying to attack your rights today, there is a reason why, and that is why we have to fight even harder to protect our vote.